Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For 28 and a half years, this TV series has explored a very wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. This month, we will do our best to celebrate the Fellowship of Reconciliation's 100 years of accomplishments in the United States. The National F.O.R. has accomplished much, but traditionally it's been too modest about promoting itself. The F.O.R. works very well with other organizations and wants to accomplish the good work, but doesn't so much care about who gets the credit for it. But we want to celebrate the accomplishments we've done over 100 years nationwide. And we can highlight in this hour only a few of these 100 years of accomplishments, but we'll illustrate these with a great many visual images that will be interesting as well as helping to tell the story. We also include examples of how the Fellowship of Reconciliation can connect with local chapters, such as the one here in Olympia, Washington, that's producing this program. And we act upon the F.O.R.'s values at the grassroots level, as do other chapters across the country. So I guarantee you that you will learn a lot about the F.O.R. that you did not already know, especially if you're totally new, but even if you're very familiar with the organization, there'll be a lot of good, juicy, and inspiring things in here. We have three guests to help us do this. Douglas Mackey was chosen by F.O.R. members in the Pacific Northwest to represent us on the F.O.R.'s National Board of Directors, which is called the National Council. He has served us for a number of years. He's been quite an expert in F.O.R. history. He's just studied the dickens out of it and keeps coming up with more exciting and inspiring things from our past. He also has served on the boards of the local F.O.R. chapter in Olympia, Washington, and on a regional board for the Western Washington part of the state. Jody Mackey has served also on Olympia F.O.R. steering committee. She has been active with Olympia F.O.R. and Veterans for Peace. She's well known and much loved for her participation in a wide variety of local peace activities and her skill as a storyteller. And many people know and appreciate her with her work for the local fair trade retail store and cafe, Traditions Fair Trade in downtown Olympia. I'm very happy to have Ron Young, who worked for the National F.O.R. on staff as the National Director of Youth Work from 1965 to 1972. During that time, the F.O.R. assigned him to organize and lead a number of very significant nationwide peace activities, especially around the Vietnam War and related issues, but also beyond that. After this, he worked for the Quaker-based American Friends Service Committee and other peace organizations. He is very well respected worldwide as a leader in working for peace in the Middle East, especially by bringing together people of different religions and nationalities. Good to have you here, Ron.
Thanks.
I'm happy to finally connect with you at this level after having known of your reputation for decades. So thank you.
Glad to be here.
So I want to just tell briefly the story about how we started as the organization. In 1914 in Europe, people knew that things were getting really hot and nasty and a war was likely to break out. So some religious leaders from throughout Europe got together to figure out what the religious community might be able to do to prevent the war from happening. And as that conference was ending in 1914, World War I was just starting to break out. So Britain and Germany were among the nations that were going to be enemies of each other at the governmental level. But two of the people at that peace conference, Henry Hodgkins and Friedrich Sigmund Schultz from Britain and Germany, resolved as they were saying goodbye at the train station that they would not treat each other like enemies, but they would continue working for peace when they got back home. Unfortunately, Sigmund Schultz, whom you can see on the screen here, was the Shan was the chaplain to the Kaiser, so he got in trouble for being for peace. But Henry Hodgkins, who you saw in the previous photo, came back to England, rallied around some friends, and they created an organization that was literally what he and his German friend resolved to be, which is a fellowship of reconciliation. So we resolve not to let governments or anybody else turn us into enemies, but to work for peace and reconciliation. In the next year, he came and visited the United States, and we founded the national level of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the United States. There's a photo here on the screen where you can see, I think it was 68 people, some good turnout, getting that rolling, and a number of people there and the other early members went on to do other good peace-related work. So we have opposed every war for 100 years, but we're more than a peace group. We also see the connection between peace and all the other issues, including economic justice, social justice, racial justice, interfaith cooperation, and so forth. So our nonviolence is grounded really in compassion, solidarity, and commitment to solving problems instead of letting governments or other people turn us into enemies. At the national level, we have a document called the Statement of Purpose that articulates what our values and our commitments are. And it talks about not just seeking peace, but also being committed to a just and peaceful world community with full dignity and freedom for every human being. That document has evolved, of course, over the years, but it offers an expansive vision for active nonviolence to transform, that's a quote from the document, every kind of oppression against any kind of person, and creating, quote, a social order in which no individual or group will be exploited or oppressed for the profit or pleasure of others, unquote. It includes offenders against society and other categories of people. A number of years ago, when I was serving on the National Board of Directors, the National Council, I successfully got the F.O.R. to expand this out from the unity of all humanity to the unity of all creation, so that the environment is part of what we are all one with. So the nonviolence that we see is really bold, it's compassionate, and it's action-oriented, and it relates to every issue. We're very good at connecting the dots. And I want to show you a poster from the early 1960s where we connected the dots between nuclear weapons and homelessness. And back in the early 60s, when people were being herded into fallout shelters to prepare for a nuclear war, the F.O.R. said that basically nuclear war is not winnable. We should not pretend that it's survivable. We need to abolish nuclear weapons. And beyond that, you'll see down here in the corner, shelters for the shelterless. The National F.O.R. said instead of looking at having fallout shelters, we should provide shelters for people who have no shelter at all, homeless folks. So it was a very good example of connecting the dots across issues back from the early 1960s. And we've been doing a lot of bold, multi-issue creative work. A lot of people over the years have worked for the F.O.R., and Jody has a list of some of the people in the United States whose names you will recognize. Can you read from that list, Jody?
Sure. A.J. Musty, Jane Addams, Albert Einstein, and Daniel Berrigan, William Sloane Coffin Jr., James Lawson, you got to work with James Lawson, yep. Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Martin Buber, Sister Joan Chittister, and Martin Luther King Jr., Jim and Shelley Douglas, Angela Lansbury, Pete Seeger, Susan Sarandon, Martin Sheen, and Joan Baez.
Yeah, and many thousands and more that are less well known.
Yes.
But there are more that we could generate if we had time to brainstorm. It's a very impressive list.
Bonnie Raitt.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Okay, and then you have a list of some international folks, a shorter list of, but a lot of prominent international folks.
Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Niemöller, the Dalai Lama is a member, Thich Nhat Hanh, Desmond Tutu, and Mary Maguire, who's the Nobel Peace Prize winner out of Ireland.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the history, we'll sort of work this program topic sequence sort of chronologically, but we'll also kind of bounce around when we need to make other links. During World War I, a number of people refused to fight in that war, including some conscientious objectors whose religious beliefs opposed war, and they were treated very, very badly by the United States government. So some F.O.R. leaders, including Roger Baldwin and others, created a project within F.O.R. that was concerned about their human rights, including free speech for people who resist war. This spun off into a separate organization called the American Civil Liberties Union. There are a lot of other organizations that began either as projects of the Fellowship of Reconciliation or with people who were grounded in F.O.R. values and who happen to be F.O.R. members. Can you mention, Doug, just a few of these organizations that have F.O.R. roots, whether spun off or just from common origins?
You mentioned the ACLU, and there were a number of people in F.O.R.'s leadership that were also instrumental in starting that one. The NAACP actually had several of F.O.R.'s leaders, John Haynes Holmes and others, helped to start that organization. Of course, over the years, it really would be hundreds. CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, and that started in Chicago, and a lot of overlap there. War Resisters League, the American Friends Service Committee in the 30s began to start cooperating, and you see them pop up throughout the years. Recently, United for Peace and Justice, Code Pink. The list is so long, you really don't even dare start because you don't know when to stop.
Yeah, it's a great happy family among all these active
I would be
folks.
remiss if I didn't mention the religious groups. Of course, there was the roots within the Protestant religion, essentially, but the National Council of Churches and its predecessors and followers, and then the religious peace fellowships, Episcopal Peace Fellowship, Buddhist Peace Fellowship, 22, now 20 different active peace fellowships that continue to collaborate.
You've researched, Doug, very extensively the history of the National F.O.R.'s publications. The current publication is called Fellowship Magazine. Before that, it had other names, began under another name in 1918. Right. Can you zip through quickly some things? You have the very first issue
yes.
here from 1918.
I should say that what happened to me was when I got to the first meeting at Shadowcliff in New York, where the headquarters are.
Shadowcliff is the name of the building.
It's the headquarters building since the mid-50s.
Yeah.
And so I'm in the basement poking around, and there are these, what they call the catacombs. I imagine you remember seeing this in...
I lived at Shadowcliff when I first went to work at F.O.R.
Yeah.
So.
That's fantastic. So anyhow, and you paw around, and then you see these names on this, and there they are, the original, and in this case, we had to go down to Swarthmore, where the archives are kept. But the first edition of the first publication to be printed in the F.O.R. headquarters, which at the time were in New York City, was The New World. And you can see, even in this first edition, that civil rights issues, the Negro and the war, talks about how African Americans were essentially used as cannon fodder. And there it is in the first edition of the publication of F.O.R. 6 months later, they made the decision to change the name of the publication. Probably not something you want to do if you're trying to get name recognition, but this one did stick. And for the next 16 years, the World Tomorrow carried incredible articles. Again, this is a March of 22, the Negro and the White, delving into some of the challenges at that time. The organization published these every month until 1933, and I brought along this stack. I won't go through all of them, but this is just a year and a half with articles from DeVere Allen, Reinhold Niebuhr, Roger Baldwin, Kirby Page, these would be outspoken, famous people in the peace movement.
Right.
And so I did want to share also one of the unusual things you would get with fellowship in 1928 through the hard effort of Norman Thomas and others, who was a candidate for the president.
As a socialist.
As a socialist, this is your F.O.R. guide to the candidates for the 1928 election. So you would have received this, and you would have gotten, wonderfully written, good journalism about the 7 candidates that were running at the time. In addition to that kind of work, the organization had access to several people who checked in with over 22,000 ministers. They started in 1931, and then you can see here they had queried almost 20,000 clergy around the country. In response to this, the tallying of what these ministers felt about war and peace, and the strong leaning to using nonviolent solutions, Albert Einstein responded, and in a later issue, F.O.R. published Albert Einstein's remarks, commenting on how incredibly helpful it would be if this organization could spread its word even farther. So the next, the publication had not only great writers, but also elicited the support of artists. And you can see how this would be eye-grabbing to the passerby who might see it, and also talking about the issues of war that were feeding the coffers of the rich. And it also went deeply into the experience in the 30s as people were realizing, my goodness, this could happen again. And so that question was raised. You'll notice on that page, Norman Thomas again, Niebuhr, Kirby Page. So the writers for this were just amazing. Included Mohandas Gandhi, who contributed. Eventually, Dr. King, many others.
It's a very. I've been reading it since the 70s. It's just an amazing repertoire of the very best, most insightful and most inspiring and most knowledgeable. It's powerful.
So then,
one of the lessons already in this, in cataloging some of this history, is the importance of carrying on, the importance of resilience. And I think at a time when many people in our country are skeptical of the possibilities of change, are despairing, some are cynical, I think there's already a lesson in this that if you're going to work for a better tomorrow, a new world tomorrow, you're going to have to do it over many years and many lifetimes, not just a flash in the pan.
Yeah, our commitment to social justice and economic justice goes along with our commitment to peace, and those also are long-term. We have one of our leaders who had been active from the 19-teens, off and on into the modern, well, actually, he stayed active until he died in the late 60s, was active in the peace movement, F.O.R., labor organizing. A.J. Muste was so good at labor organizing with the movement, the labor movement. Can you tell us something about A.J. Muste, and then we need to move on?
Sure. Well, he did join in 1916, but because of his questions about the war and how F.O.R. was responding, he left and felt that he could have more influence in working with the labor movement. So he worked with several different labor organizations, and then he was the chief of the faculty at the Labor College of Brooklyn.
Brookwood Labor College,
and stayed there for, I guess, the 20s and into the 30s, and then ended up coming back through a number of different labor organizations, and in 1950 was on the staff at F.O.R.
And so good about being collaborative and inclusive with people in different sectors and segments of the progressive and left movement, and young people, even though he was an old guy by the time of the 60s.
First time I met AJ was in 1965 in January, and I had just been appointed the National Youth Director at F.O.R. I was still in college. I was invited down to a meeting where some of the older leaders in the American peace movement were very concerned that SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, were going to have a demonstration in Washington, and there was a fear among some of the older leaders that SDS was not controlling the signs that people would carry enough, that it was a bit too confrontational. And I remember where some of the leaders tried to get agreement on a statement, A.J. Musty was the one that spoke up and said, if we make a statement like this, we're going to alienate the young people that we're trying to reach. So he held back, and even though he was probably at least one of the oldest men in the room, he understood something of the dynamic among American youth then in opposing the war and breaking out of some of the mold of anti-communism that had controlled a lot of progressive liberal movements up until that time. He was instrumental in organizing the anti-war coalition, which then put on the biggest marches both in New York and other cities and in Washington, D.C. He was a key person in that. He was principled, and you know, that was controversial at that time. But A.J. stuck to his principles.
Yeah. I want to mention some of our involvements during World War II, which were important. Of course, we opposed that, just like we opposed all the wars. And one of our members, Gordon Hirabayashi, was the only second-generation Japanese American who refused to register to go to the concentration camps when we put so many Japanese Americans into them. And but he was an F.O.R. member. It's very well documented. He also wrote a book about his experience. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where he lost. But F.O.R. people were solidly in solidarity with these folks, and the National F.O.R. was one of only two nationwide organizations, the American Friends Service Committee was the other, that strongly opposed putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps. And a lot of F.O.R. members as individuals did acts of solidarity with people. Some of them took care of their property while they were imprisoned in other places. And then some did work with them to help them get back on their feet again. So and a number of people in the greater Seattle area were very much involved with this because we have a large Japanese American population. We've always supported people whose consciences lead them to not fight in wars. Before Pearl Harbor, back in 1939 and 40, Congress was working on a new law for a military draft, and F.O.R. members such as John Swamley and others worked very hard to get conscientious objection written into the law, whereas it had not been legally protected at the time of World War I, and we succeeded in that. When World War II came along, there were hardly any peace organizations in the country, so a lot of the conscientious objectors and war resistors connected with F.O.R. and really felt sustained for the rest of their lives. And there are a few people from that generation still around, but most have passed on. But a good number of the conscientious objectors who had worked in the civilian public service camps as alternative civilian service have settled in the region where we live, the greater Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia area, and they've been great leaders and inspirers of movement over the years.
It's interesting. Recently, there has been a case of the woman in Tennessee or Kentucky, I'm a little confused, who's refused to Kentucky to perform marriages of persons of the same sex. And what has been missed, I think, in a lot of the public discussion, including media discussion, is that part of being a conscientious objector to war meant that you accepted the results of that. That is to say, you either did civilian service, as you mentioned, or you went to prison. I mean, in other words, you didn't expect to be a conscientious objector to war and then be noted by the government for your good service. I mean, it doesn't work that way. And too much of the coverage of this has been sort of missing the point that if the woman is sincere in her convictions, which I have no reason to doubt that I think she is sincere, that you then have to say, okay, I'm not going to do this. This means I shouldn't be doing this job.
Right. That's a good insight. we all know in this country that even after the Civil War, racial justice continued to be very widespread and really very brutal. And as Doug has said, we've worked on racial justice issues within the F.O.R. for most of our history. A highlight came when Martin Luther King asked for our help at the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, where people in Montgomery, Alabama, the African-American folks, were just tired of being treated so cruelly that they organized a boycott of the segregated bus system. The process went on from December of '55 to December of '66, and the National F.O.R. sent, at King's request, someone to help. The person we sent was a guy named Glen Smiley. He had a long background in nonviolent organizing with labor and civil rights and other issues. And when the first integrated bus in Montgomery rolled in December of '56, Martin Luther King asked Glen Smiley to sit in the first integrated seat with him. And so there he is. And he also, Glen Smiley also helped the F.O.R. helped the civil rights movement in a number of ways after that. After the Montgomery bus boycott, King wrote a book called Stride Toward Freedom that takes you step by step by step through the movement as they went, day by day, not knowing if it was going to work at all, and then not knowing how long it's going to take, and all kinds of setbacks. They drank a lot of coffee, stayed up late, had to keep improvising, making plans. But the book does a great job of documenting the deepening commitment to nonviolence, and he credits Glen Smiley and the Fellowship of Reconciliation, among others, that helped. But I remember somebody had told me years ago that King had said at one point that out of all of the predominantly white organizations that offered help, that the F.O.R. was the only one that was fully comfortable with black leadership.
F.O.R. also published a comic book back in those days about the Montgomery bus boycott. Right. I think it was called there. That's it, the Montgomery story. And one of the fascinating things about that I learned during the uprising in the Arab countries is that an Egyptian Arab Muslim woman took this comic book and translated it into Arabic, and thousands of copies were distributed in Egypt and in some of the other Arab countries where there was this Arab Spring, this Arab popular uprising for democracy. So it's an interesting effect, which obviously the people who did the comic book never thought that it was going to have that effect. But these things manage to the stories get told, and people pick up on them, and where they're useful, they make use of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's real movement building stuff, and it's inspiring and it works. We've got so much more to cover, and time dwindles. So I want to move on to the interfaith work briefly. It's although it started by people out of the Christian and Quaker backgrounds, it did spread to other faiths over the years, because there's that level of nonviolence and spirituality that's at a deeper level than any religious brand name. And we've figured that out long ago and moved on with that. I want to cover something of your background and involvement. We have a photo here of you on the phone, doing some organizing. You worked for the National F.O.R. staff on youth work from 1965 to 72. Share with us a story about the event in New York City on April 15, 1967.
That was a big demonstration planned to march to the United Nations. It was controversial in part because the committee organizing it, called, I think, the Spring Mobilization, decided to invite both Martin Luther King Jr. to speak and Stokely Carmichael. And they both said yes, they would speak. They both spoke at that rally. Immediately before the rally, there was a group of 50 of us, young men facing the draft, who had made a decision to burn our draft cards, to do it publicly, and to do it as a group, which was a little bit different than conscientious objection during World War II, in the sense that in World War II, which was a very popular war in many senses, people withdrew from participating in the war. They were conscientious objectors. What this movement, sort of highlighted by that day, April 15, 1967, was saying is not simply, my conscience doesn't allow me to go, but rather we won't go, and we're going to urge others not to go. That was controversial, but it was also, I think, part of the spirit of the times.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, you also have an interesting thing that you had organized. Again, F.O.R. released you from, or they assigned you as your job, organized November 13 to 15, 1969, March Against Death in Washington, D.C.
Well, the picture that you showed was a picture of me in the mobilization office for that march.
Right.
It was a march where both its opponents, which included the Nixon administration, and others who were worried about it, kept talking about how there was going to be violence, there was going to be violence. There was almost no violence at the march. Both the New York Times and Washington Post wrote very favorable stories about it. And it wound up being 500,000 people who came to that march, which no one imagined that the number was going to be that large, and another 200,000 in San Francisco. Two things happened at the end of that march, which I think say a lot about the times. One was that at the end of the march, there was a small demonstration at the Justice Department, which instead of arresting the people who were prepared to be arrested, the police used tear gas. And the tear gas spread over a large area. People were trying to get to their buses to get home, to their trains. And people were very nervous that it was getting dark, and I got calls in the office very nervous about it. So I called the Deputy Attorney General, a man named Kleindienst, whom we had negotiated with about the march route and so forth. And I said to him, look, we got a problem on the streets. People are trying to get home. The police are using tear gas. We need help to try to calm things down. He said to me, he said, this isn't a problem of the federal government now, Ronald. This is a problem for the city of Washington. Why don't you try to get some help from that nigger mayor? Well, I hung up the phone, called Mayor Washington, the mayor he just referred to, and said exactly what Kleindienst had said. The mayor, of course, was furious and immediately helped to get the police to change their tactics so that people could get on their buses and get home. The other thing that happened revealed at some points, crazy diversity of the anti-war movement. We had raised money at that march. We were $50,000 in debt when we started. Turned out we raised $150,000 from the 500,000 people, and we had to get the money into the bank. And so one of the chairpersons of the committee had a rented truck, was driving to the bank with the money. An arrangement was made to deliver it at the side door. Unfortunately, when he got to the bank, he smelled tear gas. He heard pop, pop, pop. And it turned out that the Weathermen, which was a radical, young, anti-war collective, was in front of the bank with helmets and sticks fighting the D.C. police and chanting, down with the banks, down with imperialism, while the committee that I was the coordinator of was trying to get our money into the side door of the bank.
Wow.
And it was just a story of a kind of diversity that there was in the anti-war movement that I think, though we might have done better, we probably were finally helpless to avoid, because people were reacting very strongly and angrily to the fact that the war continued. At that point, 65 to 70% of Americans were against the war, and yet Nixon was continuing it.
Yeah.
So.
And when we were on the phone to prepare for the program, I'll just do a couple quick sentences and then move on. But you had told me about the placards people wore with the names of Americans who had died, and then
38,000 Americans had died. People came to that march state by state, so that Alabama was the first state to march, and they carried the names of the sons who had been killed from Alabama since the war began, and then in alphabetical order. And the march, which went from Arlington Cemetery to the Capitol, took more than 2 days to finish because of the length of the numbers and so forth. We realized shortly after starting it, someone said, well, what about the names of the Vietnamese who have been killed? And by then, it was more than 100,000 already. Vietnamese were killed. And we realized, of course, we didn't have the Vietnamese names, and we would never have them. So what we did was include the names of Vietnamese villages on these placards that had been destroyed by our bombing. And as people carried these placards past the White House, they would lift the placard up and shout the name of the person or the village that they were carrying at the White House. And my guess is there are people today who still haven't forgotten the name of the person on the placard they carry.
Thank you for sharing. I think that's just an important thing.
Well, it is, because too often we sometimes are at fault in the anti-war movement, but too often the anti-war movement is characterized as somehow against the military. And to say the least, it wasn't the soldiers' fault that they were in Vietnam. It was the government's fault, and therefore the people's fault. And so the fact that we, in one march, both memorialized Americans who had died, but also memorialize Vietnamese, the destruction of the Vietnamese people and their villages, it seems to me is the essence of what the F.O.R. was about in opposing war.
Yeah, thanks. And the third story I want to get from you here is about your F.O.R.-sponsored interfaith and interracial study mission to Saigon in July 1970.
Very important relationship developed during the war between Alfred Hassler, who was executive of F.O.R., and the F.O.R., with Thich Nhat Hanh and Vietnamese Buddhists. Vietnamese Buddhists who opposed the war, several of whom had immolated themselves, and in fact then were examples for several Americans who immolated themselves as protest to the war. This was a very important relationship, and it was one that the F.O.R. pursued in a number of ways, and I was asked to head a delegation, as you said, interfaith and interracial, with a number of people, including Bernard Lafayette, who led the whole Selma effort for voting rights. We went to Saigon with the specific purpose of interviewing non-communists and people who were opposed to the National Liberation Front, but also many of them who opposed the war. And we came back and wrote a report, and I think interestingly, letters came from about 8 senators, I think an equal number actually of senior Republican and Democratic senators appreciating this report, because what it showed was that while the stated purpose of the war was to oppose communism, the fact is we were destroying all of Vietnam. And that Vietnamese who also may have had doubts or were opposed to communism were suffering from the war just as much as communists were. And we were, in a sense, that's why we were losing the war, because we were killing everybody. And so this report helped to substantiate that. It also, and this was somewhat troubling to Al Hassler, my boss at the time, it also, I think, substantiated that there was probably no alternative to a communist victory if the United States got out. And that was disturbing, because the hope of some, including Al, and I think Thich Nhat Hanh, was that somehow there would be a third force, something between communism and the Saigon government. But it never materialized sufficiently, and to the extent that it did materialize, it was brutally repressed by the Saigon government with U.S. support. So it wound up, as we know, that when the U.S. left, it was a communist victory. That, compared to the continuation of the war, was a positive thing. There's no doubt about it.
We're a bit tight on the time, but I want to move us through some more international stuff, because as a peace group, or an organization that's largely thought of as a peace group, besides all the other stuff we do, we've had so many international involvements. Back from 1912 to 1933, the U.S. military occupied Nicaragua, and Augusto Sandino was leading the resistance to that, and the F.O.R. sent a top leader from the F.O.R. to meet with Sandino, but Nicaragua's new dictator had Sandino assassinated before the U.S. Before the F.O.R. person could reach him. But this is an example of back long ago on horseback to Nicaragua, with solidarity for the people. During the apartheid era, our South African F.O.R. unit was interracial, which was flat out illegal during apartheid South Africa. But again, we won't let the military or the government or any repressive entity tell us who should be our enemy. And so we had blacks and whites working together in South Africa in flat out violation of the law. During the Cold War, the United States and people from the Soviet Union had exchanges. We had the U.S.-USSR Reconciliation Project. In fact, we did later on, we had on a Olympia F.O.R. TV program, we had a program with 12 teenagers from the Soviet Union and 12 from Olympia, and we all had them wear the same kind of light gray sweatshirt, and people couldn't tell who was who. I mean, the viewers didn't know who was who. It was really fun, but we had a week of activity with kids there. Tell us your experience with Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic. You got hired by the F.O.R. in '65, and one of your first international trip for the F.O.R. was to the Dominican. Can you tell us that story pretty quickly?
Yeah, I think the significance for me was that my dad always wanted me to go to West Point, and given my track record in school, there was a good chance that if I had decided to do that, I would have been able to go. And if I had gone, I would have graduated in 1964 from West Point, and therefore would have been a young officer in the American military, which was occupying the Dominican Republic, against preventing the elected president from coming back into office in the presidency. So my being there, it was it was a tearing experience for me, because I recognized the young American soldiers there as very much like me, probably having similar backgrounds in church and youth group and sports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I was meeting Dominican young people, the same age, who were absolutely opposed to the U.S. invading their country and being occupiers. So it was one of those moments in terms of the development of my own thinking about things that reinforced the kind of things that I had learned earlier from Jim Lawson.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Doug, I wonder if you could say something about the U.S.'s work in Africa. I know you're a big supporter of George Hauser, who recently passed at the age of 99. George had done amazingly good work in Africa for many years through the F.O.R. and the American Committee on Africa. Could you say just something about that?
Yeah, I think that one of the remarkable parts of his work, first of all, he was there from the early 1950s and into the 70s and beyond, helping the American Committee on Africa and working with a wide variety of groups within South Africa and other countries. And he ended up becoming the executive of that organization. And a lot of people were saying, wait a minute, you should be a black person if you're doing this. But he had earned that position, essentially, from the Africans who he was working with.
And he had a strong peace background. You see the photo here. Here he is. He was a draft resistor, and so was Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin had worked for the F.O.R. and he was doing peace work, racial justice work, and both of them had been draft resistors in World War II and did prison time for that. So there's the combination of the peace work, the conscience work, and then productive programmatic work in various ways.
Also good-looking clothes, by the way.
They dress better
That was
than we do.
lost during the 60s. Many of us sort of put those clothes aside for a while.
Can you tell us something about this image that we're going to look at now? In New York City, it's a beautiful image, and in the middle, across the middle, are a whole lot of grave markers.
But this echoes back to something Ron said earlier, and it also is related to our Olympia chapter. After shock and awe, I think a lot of us were in shock, literally. I think, in fact, the country was. And you remember in February of 2003, the world came out, and 15 million people to say no to the war. And I came to you, Glenn, to see about, this is 2007, how can we do something to honor what we've done and to recognize the civilian loss. And so you went to the national office. The national office said, yes, we will support this. And so the Iraq Memorial to Life that you just saw in that picture became a reality where people online could pick a name, or a person, didn't have a name yet, but who'd lost their lives in Baghdad or Erbil or somewhere else. And they were part of this memorial that went to 13 different places, including Staten Island, where an older man named George Hauser introduced himself to me, and at the time I was just getting to know who George was.
And then you were able to visit him in California just shortly before his death in the summer of 2015. We have activities worldwide. There's an affiliate in Latin America called the Servicio Paz y Justicia, the Service for Peace and Justice. Adolfo Perez Esquivel from Argentina was the key contact there. He got a Nobel Peace Prize. We've got decades of work on Latin America work, Task Force on Latin America and the Caribbean. We've done significant Middle East work. You got your global reputation really by doing the Middle East work, not for F.O.R. but for AFSC and others, especially bringing people together to work on things. I mean, there's so much international stuff. I want to mention just briefly, the Bosnian Student Project was a project that the National had begun in the early 90s when Bosnia was falling apart or being torn apart by exploitative politicians. The people there of different ethnicities and different groups used to get along just fine until Yugoslavia started to fall apart and certain politicians wanted to pit people against each other. And it became very dangerous for some young people, for anybody to be there, but some young people who were academically talented were especially endangered. And the National F.O.R. arranged with a Sufi Muslim sect in congregation in New York State to create this Bosnian student project so we could bring them, some of the students, to this country so they could continue their education. Bernie Meyer from Olympia and his daughter Amanda Meyer went to hear Doug Hostetter speak at the Olympia Library about this project that was just emerging, and they said, "See, maybe we can do that here." So we started talking it up. They talked to me, and we talked with others, and we started this going, and we ended up with more students coming to Olympia through the Bosnian Student Project than any other part of the country. And this was a big effort. We had a lot of organizing, a lot of fundraising. But again, it's a case where the national does something, and this had legs that local chapters could act upon and bring to fruition. Jody, go ahead.
Yeah, Colombia.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Colombia, where we've done some significant work. Tell us about the peace presence there.
Well, Colombia, like much of Central and South America, has been vastly impacted by U.S. policies. So because the land there is highly sought after for gold, for oil, for cocoa growing, it's very rich. There's been a forced migration. There's 3 different armies, the military and the paramilitary, and then these 3 armies that battle each other and displace the people that were living on the land. So it's the 2nd largest forced migration internally in the world. The first is Somalia. And so there were people who were displaced who tried to retake some of their land. And they did it by saying, we are not going to support any military. No military should enter here. This is an area of peace. And so it's
San Jose?
San Jose de...
Leopardo.
Thank you. And they started to be killed. It's varied between 600 and 1,500 people there, and 200 have been killed in the last 15 years. And so in 2005, there was a massacre where 8 people were killed. There was an 11-year-old boy, a 6-year-old girl, and an 18-month-old boy, and they were mutilated and killed. Well, in 2002, the F.O.R. started sending people from around the world to be a witness there in San Jose. And whenever there were F.O.R. people and others from outside of the country bearing witness there, being an accompanier, then there would not be the killings. And it not only stopped the killing, it supported the people saying, yes, the outside sees you, yes, you're doing the right thing. It supported them in many different ways. And that is something that this accompaniment program and this witness program happens around the world. So it happened in Vietnam.
Well, and it happened Palestinians. I was thinking Palestinians.
Palestinians,
Yeah.
and it happened, yes, Palestinians.
Yeah.
And it's also happened in Iran, not the accompaniment program, but for 30 years, Iran and the United States, the people haven't had any contact with each other. It's really easy to vilify another populace if you don't have any contact with them. So in the last 10 years, the F.O.R. sent 15 delegations, multi-faith, some women's groups, some Jewish groups, some all multi-faith, multi-sex, so that we
Sent them to Iran.
Sent them to
To
Iran.
yeah.
Oh, thank you for
no,
that.
No.
And so that we could have this contact and know that we are close human beings.
Yeah. You know, Iran is such an interesting place in that people love their poets, including their really old poets from way back when. And even high school kids have classic poetry from hundreds of years ago memorized.
It's
true. And there are streets downtown in the city is named after the poets. You have a line from Hafiz, 14th century Persian Iranian poet.
He is. We have come into this exquisite world to experience ever and ever more deeply our divine courage, freedom, and light. I've gotten to visit Afghanistan and Pakistan. They share a lot of history with Iran, a lot of culture, and this is the kind of spirit that I found in the people that I met there, and that F.O.R. Representatives met when they went into Iran. So of course, the F.O.R. celebrates and acknowledges the new nuclear agreement that's coming about between the U.S., 6 other countries, and Iran.
Yeah. Well, we're nearly out of time, but I want to end this program, or get close to the end, with the way that we normally begin the program. For people who've watched the program before, we start with saxophone music and then slides of F.O.R. history, including some local F.O.R. history. And with each image, you'll see a very brief caption in yellow lettering. Like this, the first one here, you see there's a workshop for World War II draft resistors. That's Bayard Rustin, who is an F.O.R. guy. He was a draft resistor, did time in prison, and he also urged other people to resist the draft too. But that's Bayard Rustin, not as well known as it should be, just a very significant.
But he was the guy who led the March on Washington.
Right.
Really
so the 1963 March on Washington was really his strategy, his planning, and he's not adequately recognized. And he's also one of the people, along with Jim Lawson, who helped Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement really understand the Gandhian movement. Here's the next slide that we begin with. It says, ready to board the bus for an interracial trip through the South in 1947. This was the National F.O.R.'s racial justice work in the 40s. It included this interracial journey of reconciliation through some southern states. Black and white participants rode buses together to challenge segregation in interstate bus service long before the famous Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama from 55, 56. And in the 1980s, I met a number of these people. George Hauser is one of the people in this photograph, and you mentioned George Hauser already.
So almost 20 years before the Freedom Rides.
Yes.
16.
Yeah, that came along in like 61 or something, and this was a less known predecessor. That we've mentioned the Africa work that F.O.R. we haven't mentioned it long enough because we're tight on time, but we've got really significant work with African liberation from colonialism. People in this country didn't understand the South Africa apartheid system until way later on, 70s and 80s, but there was an anti-apartheid demonstration in New York 1953, and people need to know the history goes back then. The next image, support Angolan independence. This is, again, part of our anti-colonial work. This is a civil defense protest in New York City, 1955, and I mentioned our Shelters for the Shelterless program that came along later, but we were back in the 50s exposing the stupidity of the notion that you could hide in a fallout shelter and that makes nuclear war okay.
I grew up in New Jersey, and we had practice drills in our school, which was about 15 miles from Manhattan, of pulling the shades down and climbing under our desk in case there was a nuclear war.
Yeah.
And of course, the idea that this would help save us if a bomb was dropped on New York City was absolutely scientifically insane. I mean,
and we had the same thing. I was in kindergarten in 1954, 55, and we had to do that too. Yeah. And I could tell when I was in kindergarten that was bogus. I mean, it was just like, this is really not the solution. This, again, is part of the Shelters for the Shelterless project. Martin Luther King joined the F.O.R. in the 1950s. I've seen his actual membership card that he had signed, and he was very much connected. We worked actively for peace in Vietnam. We've had this slide up for many years. The guy on the left side of this is Ron Young, who's a guest on this program, and he had been a prime organizer of this event.
This, by the way, this is the May 1970 march to protest the invasion of Cambodia.
Right.
And that march, I actually got out to the march, the 69 march. I was so busy in the office, I never got to the march.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's fun to have you as a guest on the program, and your image here on the screen that we've been showing every time we show the program for the last several decades.
200 young men turned in their draft cards in a basket that day, and I took them to Saigon as part of that delegation on repression, and we joined with Vietnamese students in burning the students' cards.
It's again a connect the dots across geography. It's a great example. Another solemn moment for peace. We work to abolish nuclear weapons. We've been opposing nuclear weapons since 1945, and we have some examples from this is on the railroad tracks at Bangor, where now there's the nuclear weapon Trident submarine. And
Who's been arrested for stopping nuclear war here? Only one.
Oh, yeah, no.
Yes, two.
I mean, not at Bangor.
yeah,
Rocky Flats was mine.
Yeah,
right, and that was the F.O.R. did a lot of organizing at Rocky Flats, Colorado, another nuclear facility, when Michael Jędrzejczyk was on staff.
Right,
back.
that's right.
I remember Michael. So this is at Bangor. The railroad tracks come in, and they were bringing in not only nuclear weapons, but during the Vietnam War, that same railroad tracks came to the base at Bangor because it has an ocean-going port, and freighters would load humongous quantities of weapons to go to Vietnam out of that. So we've been, F.O.R. people have been protesting a long time. This young girl has a Resist Trident for love and for life. This is a thing people could sign about I resist nuclear war. This is one of the many peace vigils we had at downtown Olympia. The woman on the left is Marianne Klein. She had joined the F.O.R. in 1934, worked actively for peace until she died just a couple years ago at the age of 102.
Really, Michael?
And she was...
that shows what working for peace will do for you.
It's good for you. Yeah, it really kept her going, and she was solid with us. F.O.R. people and religious people in the Philippines, but F.O.R. people also from the U.S., including Richard Dietz and others, helped with trainings for nonviolent resistance to kick out the Philippines dictators. We did that. A lot of Central America work through the Pledge of Resistance. This was a Archbishop Romero event, and this is a slide that we show at the beginning of the program where the opening credits come up, but now we're wrapping up the program. This was a Pledge of Resistance event at the Washington State Capitol building, and a number of the people in this photo are still around Olympia, but many of us have aged. So
Thank goodness.
What's interesting is I think that there's this range of accomplishments. There's so much history. If we were to have a different combination of guests, we could tell all different stories and still just barely scratch the surface. There is a part of the National F.O.R.'s website, FORUSA.org, where you could get the history laid out in some
It's really a very good website.
It's very informative. Yeah.
The aesthetic of it and all.
Yeah, it looks good and it's very functional. So it's FORUSA.org, and you can click the part that's about.
Right.
And then within the about part, you can click the history part. You can also, at the about part, click the part for the statement of purpose, the SOP, it'll say, and that'll have explicitly laying out what our values and commitments are. There's also another part of the website where you can find local chapters that try to take the F.O.R. message and put it into practice at the local level, as we do here in Olympia, and they do in Louisville, Kentucky, and a number of other places. I want to put in a plug for Ron Young's 2014 book, which I've really been enjoying reading. It's Crossing Boundaries in the Americas, Vietnam, and the Middle East. If you like what Ron's been talking about in the program, read this book. It's great, very insightful and warm and personal. I want to thank Doug and Jody and Ron. I want to thank the people who also helped with the program but are not on camera. Fred Silsby did a lot of work with the images. Dennis Mills did a lot of work with the images. And Doug, of course, a lot of these images. I want to thank Bob Ziegler, who did some of the photography of the slides that we saw from F.O.R. history here in Olympia. And I appreciate all the people in the Fellowship of Reconciliation, including worldwide through the international F.O.R., let alone the national and all of our pals at the local level. You can get information about a lot of things through the Olympia F.O.R.'s website, www.olympiafor.org, or call us at 360-491-9093. We're all part of one human family. We all share one planet. You can create a better planet if we all work at it. And the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.